Hi everyone, I hope you enjoyed your weekend. Today we're going to start reading Act 3 of Macbeth, and I want to talk to you about a new theme that's going to really develop throughout this act, the idea of fate versus free will. So I want to show you first a quick video that kind of recaps a little bit of what fate is, and then I'll talk to you about how this particular type of theme has been developing from the beginning of the story. So take a look at your screen. It's a cute short video, again, on the idea of fate.
Fate. Whether it's an explanation for something big happening or an excuse for our own success or failure, fate is a popular idea. It's the idea that our life's journey is already mapped out ahead of us. It's certainly popular with Macbeth, especially when some witches tell him that it's his fate to be king. Does Macbeth have any choice? Or is it all down to fate? It's not just the audience trying to figure this out, Macbeth is too. He's happy to accept his fate to be king, but isn't cheating fate on when Banquo's kids get their thumbs up to be kings. Macbeth thinks he can cheat fate. His fate-cheating tactics aren't subtle. None of Macbeth's tactics are. Violence isn't the only way to get to the top. What about flower arranging? I don't know how fate works. That's how.
Okay, so that idea kind of talked to you briefly about this idea of fate. Sometimes we want to take things into our own hands, but they can obviously turn out very bad for us. So this theme of fate, some people believe that there is a certain path that has already been set out for us, and nothing we do in life can change this. So we have to think about whether or not we believe in fate, and if the choices you make can indeed shape your life. So we see in Macbeth that he learns about his fate from the witches. So do we think that Macbeth has a choice in what happens to him, or have the witches done something to have these things occur to him through their use of magic, of evil magic? So we saw the witches really begin the play. That's the first scene in Act 1, and it's the driving mechanism, the driving force for all of Macbeth's actions from that point forward. We know that Macbeth is a very brave warrior, but we never see that in the actual play. The story begins right after he has finished fighting those two very different wars that took place again before the play began. So the witches coming in and telling Macbeth that he is going to be Thane and he will become king is really the driving force of everything we see Macbeth do. So the witches again predict that Macbeth becomes king. Right after that, Ross, one of the attendants, arrives and he tells Macbeth that he has been given the title Thane of Cawdor. So Macbeth listens to the witch's prophecy, and immediately after, one of them comes true. This is then what forces or allows Macbeth to believe what the witches are saying. But then as active readers, we need to figure out, could the witches have overheard the news before they or Ross arrived to meet Macbeth, or could they have done something to cause him to become the Thane of Cawdor? Could it just be a coincidence? Regardless of what it is, Macbeth believes the witches, and he can't stop thinking about being king. The witches, however, don't tell him how he's going to become king. They never tell him to kill King Duncan. This is what he chooses to do. So this is then when that idea of fate versus free will comes into play. So the evidence, when Macbeth meets the witches, these are the three things that they tell him. Hail, Macbeth, Thane of Glamis. That's what he is. Hail, Macbeth, Thane of Cawdor, what he becomes in the beginning of the play. And then all hail Macbeth that shall be king hereafter. And this is what we're going to see if it does occur. So I want us to take a look at at the first scene of Act 3 together. We'll talk about some of the conversations that occur mainly between Banquo and Macbeth, and then what Macbeth tells the audience. He's talking to himself in a lot throughout this scene, and how this develops the idea of fate. So let's take a look at scene 1 of Act 3 together. So before we get started reading through the first two scenes of Act 3, in the lesson folder you have this background information which will help us to better understand some of the vocabulary terms used in the act, as well as give us some background information on some of the people that Macbeth is going to make reference to. So if you take a look on your screen, we have the word posterity, which means future generations, like children or grandchildren. Chide here is to kill. Macbeth calls or uses the word parricide in the first scene, which refers to a child killing a parent. The word not means nothing, mirth, joy, ruby, red. And then you also have some background information here. Mark Antony and Octavius. It says after Julius Caesar was assassinated, Antony and Octavius joined forces to defeat Cassius and Brutus, who were co-conspirators in the assassination of Julius Caesar. They also had help from a third man, Lepidus. History has it that although Antony and Octavius were friends, later Octavius turns on Antony and defeats him to become the king of Rome. So we have to use the reference to Mark Antony and Octavius as a parallelism between Banquo and Macbeth. You also have Akron. That's a river in Hades, or the underworld, where people go after they are dead. And then the last one on your screen is the literary term apostrophe. You really will not see this come up very often, and the only reason why I'm giving it to you is because it's a very specific term that has to do with a soliloquy or an aside. In scene 1 of Act 3, Macbeth has his soliloquy, but it's really defined as an apostrophe, because during this type of a soliloquy, the character speaks to someone who is dead or really isn't there. It could be a figment of their imagination. Whereas when you have only a soliloquy, the character is just thinking out loud for us to know their inner thoughts, because we wouldn't be able to know that, especially if we're watching something being performed on stage. So again, you have this reference in the lesson folder for today. Let's take a look at the beginning of Act 3. So if you have your script downloaded, scene 1 of Act 3 begins on page 28 of your script. We have Banquo. He has a soliloquy here. Remember that a soliloquy is a speech given by one character alone on stage, and that helps to reveal their innermost thoughts. In this case here, we're going to learn what Banquo is afraid of.
Thou hast it now, King, Cawdor, Glamis, all as the weird women promised, and I fear thou play'st most foully for't.
So right off the bat, in the beginning of this scene, Banquo tells us what he's afraid of. He's basically talking about Macbeth, and he says, well, you have it all now. You're king, you're Thane of Cawdor, as well as the Thane of Glamis. So here we find out that since King Duncan has died and his sons have fled the scene, you learned in the previous act why they're afraid of what could happen to them. They don't. They believe that there's no one they could trust in the country. Banquo tells us that now Macbeth has been kinged. So now he's just afraid that he was able to achieve this in an ill way, right? So they use that word posterity, and I kind of went over that with you briefly. You have a copy of that information in the lesson folder for today. It refers to generations, to your offspring.
Yet it was said it should not stand in thy posterity, but that myself should be the root and father of many kings. If there come truth from them, as upon thee, Macbeth, their speeches shine, why, by the verities on thee made good, may they not be my oracles as well, and set me up in hope? But hush, no more.
Here's our chief guest.
If he had been forgotten, it had been as a gap in our great feast, and all thing unbecoming.
Tonight we hold a solemn supper, sir, and I'll request your presence.
Let your highness command upon me, to the which my duties are with a most indissoluble tie forever knit.
Ride you this afternoon.
Aye, my good lord.
We should have else desired your good advice, which still hath been both grave and prosperous in this day's council, but we'll take tomorrow. Is't far you ride?
As far, my lord, as will fill up the time twixt this and supper. Go not my horse the better, I must become a borrower of the night for a dark hour or twain.
Fail not our feast.
My lord, I will not.
We hear our bloody cousins are bestowed in England and in Ireland, not confessing their cruel parricide, filling their hearers with strange invention. But of that tomorrow, when therewithal we shall have cause of state craving us jointly. Hie you to horse, adieu, till you return at night. Goes Fleance with you?
Aye, my good lord. Our time does call upon us.
I wish your horses swift and sure of foot, and so I do commend you to their backs. Farewell. Let every man...
So I'm going to stop here because there's a lot of information that's given to us in these in this short part of the scene here. Let me bring us back to the conversation that Banquo and Macbeth are having. So again, Banquo is telling us how he fears that Macbeth has done something evil. In this case, he's referring to killing the king in order for him to become king. And then Macbeth enters with Lady Macbeth and all of their attendants, and he's very happy. Him and Lady Macbeth, very different from Act 2, where they were afraid and acting as if they were upset over the king's death. Macbeth asks Banquo if he's going to join them for a banquet, that he is going to be, their great guest. And Banquo says that he will be there, but that he's going for a ride. He's going to take his horse and go out for a little bit, and he should return later on. This is important to note. Macbeth goes, and here in these lines here, around lines 20, Macbeth says, "We would have liked to have heard your good advice, which has always been serious and helpful, at the council today, but we'll wait until tomorrow. Are you riding far?" And Banquo says, "I'm going far enough that I'll be riding from now until dinner. Unless my horse goes faster than expected, I will be back an hour or two after sunset." And Macbeth reminds him, "Don't miss dinner." And Banquo says he won't. Then Macbeth goes and he says, "Have you heard about the princes?" In other words, King Duncan's sons. And he refers to them as murderers. So at this point, because Malcolm and Donalbain fled after their father was discovered killed, everyone believes that they are responsible for their father's death. And the rumor is that one is in England and one is in Ireland. Remember, Macbeth is in Scotland. So he says they haven't confessed to cruelly murdering their own father, and they've been making up strange lies to tell their host. But we can talk more about that tomorrow, when we'll discuss matters of state that concern us both. So here, Macbeth gives us a lot of important information. So I want to go ahead and highlight this for us so that we have it. Okay. We learn again that everyone believes that Malcolm and Donalbain are responsible for their father's death. And then Macbeth wants to discuss matters of state that concern both him and Banquo. We know that then this would refer to the prophecy of the witches. And then Macbeth asks Banquo if his son, Fleance, is going to go with him. And Banquo answers yes, they're going to go together. So Macbeth again hopes that they have a good trip, and he bids them farewell. Remember that in the previous act we talked about this difference of appearance versus reality. Macbeth appears to be heartbroken when he finds out that the king has been murdered, and the only person who knows about the prophecy aside from Lady Macbeth is Banquo. But here, Macbeth continues with that hypocrisy, and he makes it seem that he is a very a good friend to Banquo, when in reality we know that he fears Banquo because the prophecy is that Banquo's son will become king and not Macbeth's own children. So take a look at what Banquo says as he leaves this scene.
Man be master of his time till 7 at night. To make society the sweeter welcome, we will keep ourselves till supper time, alone. Well then, God be with you. Sirrah, a word with you. Attend those men our pleasure.
They are, my lord, without the palace gate.
Bring them before us. To be thus is nothing, but to be safely thus. Our fears in Banquo stick deep, and in his royalty of nature reigns that which would be feared. 'Tis much he dares, and to that dauntless temper of his mind he hath a wisdom that doth guide his valor to act in safety. There is none but he whose being I do fear, and under him my genius is rebuked, as it is said Mark Antony's was by Caesar. He chid the sisters when first they put the name of king upon me, and bade them speak to him. Then, prophet-like, they hailed him father to a line of kings. Upon my head they placed a fruitless crown, and put a barren scepter in my grip, thence to be wrenched with an unlineal hand, no son of mine succeeding. If it be so, for Banquo's issue have I filed my mind. For them, the gracious Duncan, have I murdered, put rancors in the vessel of my peace, only for them and mine eternal jewel given to the common enemy of man, to make them kings. The seeds of Banquo, kings. Rather than so, come fate into the list, and champion me to the utterance. Who's there?
So I want to stop here. We have a very long soliloquy from Macbeth, and I want to talk to you a lot about this. So if, as you saw in the beginning, before we began the scene, we talked about these different names, Mark Antony and Caesar. You have that information so you can understand what Macbeth is talking about. But in this particular soliloquy, we learn that Macbeth is also very fearful, and he fears Banquo. I want us to take a look at some of the things that he says, and I also want us to note, keeping in line with our aim from last week about structure. So if we take a look at what he's saying, he goes and he begins, to be thus is nothing, but to be safely thus. Our fears in Banquo stick deep, and in his loyalty of nature reigns that which would be feared. 'Tis much he dares, and to that dauntless temper of his mind he hath a wisdom that doth guide his valor to act in safety. Notice here the repetition of these words. I have safety. Let's see if I can highlight it for us. And safety again. So I need to figure out exactly why Macbeth is repeating these words. He also goes and he talks about fear. Here the word fear is repeated a few times. And he also talks to us about Banquo's character. He has wisdom, valor, and he's going to stick up for what is right. So these are the things that cause Macbeth to fear Banquo. He is a righteous man, and we know that Macbeth hasn't done everything correctly. So the repetition of these words really bring out this idea of fear and Macbeth's desire to feel safe. Okay, so I'm going to write that down on the side for us so that we remember this as we begin to study Act 3. So Macbeth fears Banquo, desires, should I write desires? Yeah. Desires to feel safe. He goes on and he says, then prophet-like they hailed him father to a line of kings. This is again one of the reasons why Macbeth is fearful. They hailed him father to a line of kings. Upon my head they placed a fruitless crown and put a barren scepter in my grip. So in other words, they're saying, whoa, this prophecy causes Banquo to profit over what I did. And that is why Macbeth is upset. So Macbeth is upset because the prophecy causes Banquo's sons to become king. So in other words, they profit off of Macbeth's deeds. And again, this is something that Macbeth doesn't like. So he goes and he explains that he was the one who murdered Duncan. And he says, for what? Only to see Banquo's seed profit out of this. Okay, so here is the part that I want us to focus on and the aim for today, this idea of fate versus free will. Macbeth says, rather than allow Banquo's sons to become king, he says, come fate into list and champion me to the utterance. So he says, I will challenge fate to battle and fight to the death. So here is this idea of theme. Okay. And I'm going to write it over here so we can all see it. So this is the theme of fate versus free will. Macbeth will go against fate. And so we need to ask ourselves, is this going to work out in Macbeth's favor? So as he's talking, if you notice, it says 2 murderers enter. Macbeth calls out, who is there? And he continues on. Let's take a look at it together.
Now go to the door and stay there till we call. Was it not yesterday we spoke together?
It was, so please your highness.
Well then. Now, have you considered of my speeches? Know that it was he, in the times past, which held you so under fortune which you thought had been our innocent self. This I made good to you in our last conference, passed in probation with you, how you were borne in hand, how crossed, the instruments who wrought with them, and all things else that might to half a soul, and to a notion craze, say, thus did Banquo.
You made it known to us.
I did so, and went further, which is now our point of second meeting. Do you find your patience so predominant in your nature that you can let this go? Are you so gospelled to pray for this good man and for his issue, whose heavy hand hath bowed you to the grave and beggared yours forever?
We are men, my liege.
Aye. In the catalogue you go for men. as hounds and greyhounds, mongrels, spaniels, curs, shuffs, water rugs, and demi-wolves are clept all by the name of dogs, the valued file distinguishes the swift, the slow, the subtle, the housekeeper, the hunter, every one according to the gift which bounteous nature hath in him closed, whereby he does receive particular addition from the bill that writes them all alike, and so of men. Now, if you have a station in the file, not in the worst rank of manhood, say it, and I will put that business in your bosoms whose execution takes your enemy off, grapples you to the heart and love of us, who wear our health but sickly in his life, which in his death were perfect.
I am one, my liege, whom the vile blows and buffets of the world hath so incensed that I am reckless what I do to spite the world.
And I another, so weary with disasters, tugged with fortune, that I would set my life on any chance to mend it or be rid on't.
Both of you know Banquo was your enemy.
True.
True, my lord.
So is he mine, and in such bloody distance that every minute of his being thrusts against my nearest of life. And though I could, with barefaced power, sweep him from my sight, and bid my will avouch it, yet I must not, for certain friends that are both his and mine, whose loves I may not drop, but wail his fall, who I myself struck down. And thence it is that I to your assistance do make love, masking the business from the common eye for sundry weighty reasons.
We shall, my lord, perform what you command us.
Though our lives...
Your spirits shine through you. Within this hour, at most, I will advise you where to plant yourselves, acquaint you with the perfect spy of the time, the moment on't, for it must be done tonight, and something from the palace. Always thought that I require a clearness. And with him, to leave no rubs nor botches in the work, Fleance, his son that keeps him company, whose absence is no less material to me than is his father's, must embrace the fate of that dark hour. Resolve yourselves apart. I'll come to you anon.
We are resolved, my lord.
I'll call upon you straight. Abide within. It is concluded. Banquo, thy soul's flight, if it find heaven, must find it out tonight.
And that's the end of scene 1. So let's quickly recap the important parts of this conversation between Macbeth and the murderers. So we know that Macbeth has decided that he is going to go against fate. He is going to try and change the prophecy that Banquo's sons will become king. And as I pointed out in the beginning of the scene, Macbeth knows that Banquo is riding out with his son, and they're pretty far away from the castle, so it will take them a pretty long time to get back. So he's using this information to plot Banquo's death. And he tells the murderers that it was Banquo who never allowed them to prosper. It was because of Banquo that these murderers were never able to attain a new position in the king's, army. And so he says he's your enemy, and he's also mine. So we need to get rid of Banquo. He goes on, and the murderer seemed a little bit iffy about whether or not they wanted to commit the murder, but Macbeth says, I did everything for you. I gave you a new position as king. I would kill Banquo myself, but we have friends in common, and because of that, I can't be the one to get rid of him. So Macbeth also tells them that they need to make sure that the death is perfect. In other words, they need to make very well, they need to be very assured that Banquo dies, and it's not looked as if he was killed. He wanted to be seen more as an accident. So they finally agree that they are going to do that. And Macbeth says, by the way, he is with his son, and it's just as important for me that Banquo dies as well as his son. Okay. So if you take a look at the modern translation here on the screen, he says, getting rid of Fleance is as important to me as knocking off Banquo. Each of you should make up your own mind about whether you are going to do this. I'll come to you soon. And they decide on the spot, yes, we will do it, we're in. And so Macbeth says, great, I will see you tomorrow. And he ends this particular scene by saying, the deal is closed. Banquo, if your soul is going to make it to heaven, tonight's the night. So I just want to write on here the side so that we keep some notes in our script, that this is when Macbeth, or the idea, I'm going to write the idea of fate is developed as Macbeth plans to kill Banquo and his son in order to change the fate the witches predicted, or the prophecy. Okay. So let's take a look at scene 2. In scene 2, we're going to see conversation between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. And as part of your work last week, I asked you to discuss the relationship, the dynamic between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. A lot of you were discussing how Lady Macbeth takes on a more dominant role, but I wanted you to go in a little deeper than that and figure out exactly why Macbeth would allow his wife to take on this dominant role, or at least believe that she is in a dominant role. So before we look at this scene, I just want to cover a few points that I want us to really focus on, and that's primarily how the mental state of both Lady Macbeth and Macbeth stand at this point in the story. So take a look at your screen for scene 2 of Act 3.
Is Banquo gone from court?
Aye, madam, but returns again tonight.
Say to the king I would attend his leisure for a few words.
Madam, I will.
Naught's had, all spent, where our desire is got without content. 'Tis safer to be that which we destroy than by destruction dwell in doubtful joy.
So right off the bat, Lady Macbeth is already kind of showing regret for what they did. If you take a look at the modern translation, she says, if you get what you want and you're still not happy, you've spent everything and gained nothing. It's better to be the person who gets murdered than to be the killer and be tormented with anxiety. I'm going to highlight this for us because I feel that it's very important. Here, Lady Macbeth, again, feels guilt for what she's done. And we'll write that in on the side. Okay. This idea of doubtful joy is anxiety. So she is full of anxiety over what they did to the king. And she makes a note that she would rather be the person who's dead than the one who's still alive and needs to deal with all of this anxiety. So Macbeth enters, and they're going to have a conversation.
How now, my lord? Why do you keep alone? Of sorriest fancies your companions making, using those thoughts which should indeed have died with them they think on. Things without all remedy should be without regard. What's done is done.
We have scourged the snake, not killed it. She'll close and be herself whilst our poor Malice remains in danger of her former tooth. But let the frame of things disjoint. Both the worlds suffer ere we will eat our meal in fear and sleep in the affliction of these terrible dreams that shake us nightly. Better be with the dead, whom we, to gain our peace, have sent to peace, than on the torture of the mind to lie in restless ecstasy. Duncan is in his grave. After life's fitful fever, he sleeps well. Treason has done his worst. Nor steel, nor poison, malice, domestic, foreign levy, nothing can touch him further.
Okay, so let's stop here. Obviously, Macbeth is very upset. I'm just going to bring this screen up a little bit because what Lady Macbeth has said, and we annotated here, is going to be important to the development of this scene. So Macbeth enters, and Lady Macbeth wants to know, did they kill Banquo? Are we done? And Macbeth says, well, we didn't kill it. He says, we slashed the snake, but not killed it. So now Macbeth is in trouble because he ordered Banquo to be killed and it didn't go according to plan. He says it will heal and be as good as new and will be threatened by its fangs once again. So we need to figure out exactly who Macbeth is talking about at this point. Okay. So we need to find out, is Banquo and Fleance alive or dead? So he goes and he says, but the universe can fall apart and heaven and earth crumble before I'll eat my meals in fear and spend my nights tossing and turning with these nightmares I've been having. So Macbeth has had these nightmares, right? And Lady Macbeth is also telling us that she is tormented with anxiety. So this goes back to their mental state, and I want to make a note of that for us. Move it over. See if I can. Sorry. The Macbeth's mental state is on a downward spiral. Okay, they are not handling this very well, and Macbeth says, "I'm going to refuse to eat until I get rid of this fear. I need to do something so that I can get my peace back." And again, referring back to what Lady Macbeth is saying, she told us that it's better to be the person who gets murdered. The person who is gone, sleeping, they don't have to worry about anything. Macbeth mirrors that. He says Duncan lies in his grave through with life's trouble and he's sleeping well. So he says, that's not fair. I can't have somebody that I murdered be in a more peaceful state than I am. So again, this is referring back to that mental state that both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are in. And this really helps to advance the plot because it shows how much they're willing to do whatever it takes to get rid of that last part of the prophecy that Banquo's kids will become king. So let's continue on to see what Lady Macbeth is going to respond to this.
Come on, gentle, my lord. Sleek o'er your rugged looks. Be bright and jovial among your guests tonight.
So shall I, love, and so I pray be you. Let your remembrance apply to Banquo. Present him eminence both with eye and tongue. Unsafe the while that we must lave our honors in these flattering streams, and make our faces vizards to our hearts, disguising what they are.
You must leave this.
Oh, full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife. Thou knowest that Banquo and his Fleance lives.
But in them nature's copies not etern.
There's comfort yet. They are assailable. Then be thou jocund. ere the bat hath flown his cloistered flight, ere to black Hecate summons the shard-born beetle with his drowsy hums hath rung night's yawning peal, there shall be done a deed of dreadful note.
What's to be done?
Okay, so I'm going to stop here because, based again on our conversation, that discussion that you had for Act 2, here you see that Lady Macbeth is not the dominant one anymore. Macbeth is the one who is taking charge. So I want us to note that on the side. Okay. So Lady Macbeth is not the dominant one anymore. Macbeth is taking charge. And we see that Lady Macbeth is again very afraid. Right? Just make this a little bit better for us. And she tries to comfort her husband, and she says, even though Banquo and Fleance live, they can't live forever. And Macbeth agrees. He says, there's comfort there. They can be killed, it's true. They're not immortal. But then he goes and he says, before the bat flies through the castle and before the dung beetle makes his little humming noise to tell us it's nighttime, a dreadful deed will be done. So he's saying before the night is over, he's going to make sure that Banquo and his son are dead. And so Lady Macbeth is asking, what are you going to do? And notice what Macbeth says.
Innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck, till thou applaud the deed. Come, sealing night, scarf up the tender eye of pitiful day, and with thy bloody and invisible hand cancel and tear to pieces that great bond which keeps me pale. Light thickens, and the crow makes wing to the rooky wood. Good things of day begin to droop and drowse, whilst night's black agents to their praise do rouse. Thou marvelst at my words, but hold thee still. Things bad begun make strong themselves by ill. So prithee, go with me.
And that brings us to the end of scene 2. So I want to recap what just happened here. Lady Macbeth says to her husband, asks him, what is it that you're going to do? And Macbeth says, it's better you don't know until after it's done. So this is a good example of Macbeth taking control over the situation, right? So Macbeth takes control over situation, not Lady Macbeth. So she's not the dominant one anymore. Okay. It also shows that Macbeth is more ruthless than Lady Macbeth. As he is speaking, she's afraid. She can't believe what it is that he is saying. Macbeth goes and he asks the knight to take away Banquo and Fleance, very similar to Lady Macbeth in Act 1, when she wanted the knight to unsex her and allow her to become more like a man. Okay. So the last part that I want to note for us here is what Macbeth says at the very end. He says, bad deeds force you to commit more bad deeds. And this helps to, again, develop the plot. It advances the plot. So this idea advances the plot because Macbeth, I guess he's foreshadowing more evil things that will occur. Okay. So the story is not over yet. We need to continue to see how Macbeth is going to see how one bad deed, killing King Duncan, forces him to continue to commit more bad deeds. Okay, so let's just quickly recap some of the things that we've learned in scene 2. What you're going to do is read scenes 3 and 4 for Wednesday. So at the end of these 2 scenes, what we see is how Shakespeare develops Macbeth's character as he's trying to cheat fate. Macbeth tries to cheat fate by killing Duncan. The witch's prophecy, again, predicted that Banquo's children will be the future kings, and because of that, Macbeth feels cheated. He's damned himself for someone else's children, and therefore he wants to fix that. He wants to change the fate, the predictions, to suit him, and he's going to try and cheat fate so that he can get what he wants. And so he decides again to kill Banquo. And we see him doing this in the very beginning of the act. Rather than so, come fate into the list and champion me to the utterance. And in scene 2, we see how he goes about doing that.